Chapter 28 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 28. It was the end of February, and the Roman villa was soon to be left to cobwebs and custodians. The Piazza di Spagna and the broad steps of the Trinità were alive with spring flowers, and the air had the soft sweetness of an English April on the verge of May. White lilac and Maréchal Niel roses were in all the shops. Bright yellow jonquils and red and blue anemones filled the baskets of rustic hawkers at the street corners. Rome's innumerable fountains plashed and sparkled in the sun, and Rome's delicious atmosphere, at once soft, caressing, and inspiriting, made the heart glad. The carnival was over and the season was waning. Lady Susan Amphlett was never tired of telling people that she had had the best time she had ever had in her life. Excursions to Naples, Florence, and all the cities of Tuscany, motor drives to every place worth seeing within 50 miles of Rome, a midnight party with fireworks in the baths of Caracalla, a dance by torchlight, and a champagne supper in the Colosseum. In this latter festivity, the strangeness of the scene had been too exciting, and the revel had almost degenerated into an orgy. "My cousin is simply wonderful at inventing things," Susie, playing her accustomed part of chorus, told people, "and he gets permissions and privileges that no one else would dare ask for." The end had come. Tomorrow's meet at the tomb of Cecilia Metella was the last of the season, and Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford were to start for London on the following day. A long journey in a lit salon, with the monotony of dinner-wagon meals to make the journey odious. "If one could only take a box of Bath buns and foie gras sandwiches," sighed Susie. "With those and my tea-basket I should be utterly happy. But the same insipid omelette and the same tough chicken and endive salad for 48 hours? Quelle corvée!" It was the last morning, a lovely morning. Sunshine was flooding the great rooms and making even the tapestried walls look gay. Susan, for once in her life, came down to breakfast, in a black satin negligée, with a Valenciennes cap that made her look enchanting. "I wanted to see Claude in pink, Roman pink," she said, looking at the slim, tall figure in Leicestershire clothes. "You ought to always wear those clothes," said Susie, clapping her hands as at the reception of her favourite actor. "They make you bewilderingly beautiful. Now I know why you are so keen on hunting." "Do you think any man cares how his coat is cut, or who made his boots, when he may be dead at the bottom of a ditch before the end of the run?" Claude said, laughing. "Some of the best days I've had have been in rat-catcher clothes." He was radiant with pleasant expectations. He could do without Leicestershire hedges and 100-acre fields and all the perfection of English fox-hunting. To-day the Campagna would be good enough, with its rough ground and yawning chasms, wider and deeper than the worst of the Somersetshire rhines. The Campagna would be good enough. He was in high spirits, and he was singing a wicked little French song as his man buckled on his spurs, a little song that Gavroche and his companions of the Paris gutters had been singing all the winter. Lady Susan drove to the meet in one of the Provana carriages, picking up a couple of lively American friends on her way. Vera excused herself from going with her friend, and went off for a ramble with the Irish terrier, much to Susie's disgust. "You like that rough-haired beast's company better than mine," she complained. "Only when I want to be alone with memories and dreams." "You are growing too horribly morbid, Vera. I'm afraid you have taken up religion. It's very sweet of you, darling, but it's the way to lose your husband. Religion is the one thing a husband won't put up with. He hates it worse than a bad cook." "No, I have not taken up religion." "Then it's spiritualism, which is just as bad. It's all Mr. Simeon's doing. You live in a world of ghosts." "There are ghosts that one loves. But there will be no ghosts where I shall be walking to-day, only wild flowers and spring sunshine." She watched Susan take her seat in the carriage, a vision of coquettish prettiness and expensive clothes. Susan's husband had gone back to London and Newmarket some time since, not being able to "stick" Rome after the Craven meeting. He had enjoyed some good runs with the Roman pack, and he had been shown St. Peter's and the Colosseum, and had played bridge with famous American players at Claude Rutherford's club. So what more was there for him to do? Vera and her dog went to the Campagna by a roundabout way that avoided that noble road between the tombs of the mighty by which the hunting men and their followers would go. She roamed in rural lanes where violets and wild hyacinths were scenting the warm air, and sat in a solitary nook, musing over a volume of Carducci, while Boroo hunted the hedge and scratched the bank, in a wild quest of the rats that haunted his dreams as he sprawled on the Persian prayer rug before the fire. It was late afternoon when Vera left the quiet lane and turned into the dusty road that led to the tomb of Cecilia Metella, lingering on her way to admire a team of those magnificent fawn-coloured and cream-white oxen whose beauty always went to her heart. She recalled Carducci's lovely sonnet, Il Bove, those exquisite lines which Giulia Provana had repeated to her as they drove along the rural roads near San Marco, and which she learned from her friend's lips before she had ever seen a printed page of the Italian's verse. All signs of horse and hound had disappeared before she came to Cecilia's tomb. There were no people in carriages, no loitering peasants or British bicyclists, waiting about on the chance of a ringing run, which would bring pack and field sweeping round the wide plain in sight of the starting point. There was no one, only the vast expanse of greyish-green herbage, with here and there a heap of ruins that had been a palace or a tomb, and here and there a red-capped shepherd and his flock. Vera strolled along the grass, taking no heed of vehicles or foot passengers on the higher level of the Appian Way. She had her time chiefly engaged in keeping Boroo to heel, where only duty could keep him, instinct and a passionate inclination urging him to make a raid on the sheep. Distance would have been as nothing. He would have crossed the expanse of rugged ground in a flash, if Vera's frown and Vera's threatening voice had not subjugated that which, next to fighting, was a master passion. She was absorbed in her endeavour to keep the faithful beast under control, when the sound of laughter on the road above made her come to a sudden stop, and look and listen. She knew the laugh. It had once been music in her ears. That frank, joyous laugh, the ripple of gladness that defied the fates, had once been an element in the glamour that cast its spell over her life. But now the laugh jarred. There was a false note in the music. A woman was riding at Claude's bridle hand, their horses walking slowly, close together, and he was leaning over her to listen and to talk. His hand was on her saddle, and their heads were very near as he bent to speak and to listen. Vera could hear their voices in the clear air of a Roman sundown, but not the words that they were speaking. One thing only was plain, that after each scrap of talk there came the ripple of joyous laughter from the man, and then, after a little more talk, with head still closer, the boisterous mirth of a reckless woman. The woman was Mrs. Bellenden. What other rider after those Roman hounds had a figure like hers, the exquisite lines, the curves of bust and throat that the sculptors were talking about? The woman was Mrs. Bellenden, in one of her amusing moods. That was her charm, as Susan Amphlett had explained it to Vera. She made men laugh. "That is her secret," said Susan. "She remembers all the stories her madcap husband told her when she was young, and they shocked her. She dishes them up with a spice of her own, and she makes men laugh. She can keep them dangling for a year and hold them at arm's length, while a mere beauty would bore them after a month, unless she came to terms. That's her secret. But, of course, it comes to the same in the end. Such a woman's affairs must have the inevitable conclusion. Her pigeons last longer in the plucking, and she gets more feathers out of them. You had better look after your husband before he goes too far." Nothing had moved Vera from her placid acceptance of fate. "I suppose my husband must amuse himself with a flirtation now and then, when his racing stable begins to pall," she said. "Vera, you and Claude are drifting apart!" exclaimed Susie, with a horrified air. It was a gruesome discovery for Chorus, who had gone about the world singing the praises of this ideal couple, these exquisite married lovers, and talking about Eden and Arcadia. Vera smiled an enigmatic smile. Drifting apart? No, it was not drifting apart. It was a cleft as wide and deep as one of those yawning chasms on the Campagna, that the sportsmen boasted of jumping with their Northamptonshire hunters. This was Vera's last day in Rome. They started on the homeward journey next morning, but instead of travelling with her husband by the Paris express, she took it into her head to linger on the way. She stopped at Pisa, she stopped at Portofino, she stopped at Genoa, and last of all she stopped at San Marco to look at Mario Provana's grave. "I may never see Italy again," she said when Susan tried to dissuade her. "I have a presentiment that I shall never see this dear land any more." "For my part, I should not be sorry if I knew I was never coming back to the villa," her husband answered. "It is too big for a house to live in. It must soon fall to the fate of other Roman palaces, and become one of the sights of the city, to be shown for 2 lire a head to Dr. Lunn and his fellow travellers." Vera had her way. In this respect she and her husband were essentially modern. They never interfered with each other's caprices. He travelled by the Paris express, and stayed at the Ritz just long enough to see the latest impropriety at the Palais Royal. And it happened curiously that Mrs. Bellenden was travelling by the same train, on the same day, stopping at the same hotel, attended by a young lady who would have been faultless as a dame de compagnie, except for a chronic neuralgia, which often compelled her to isolate herself in her hotel bedroom. Vera went along the lovely coast with Susie, who declared herself delighted to escape the monotony of the dinner wagon, and to see some of the most delicious spots in Italy with her dearest V, to which monosyllable friendship had reduced Vera's name. In an age that has substituted the telegraph and the telephone for the art of letter writing, it is well that names should be reduced to the minimum, and that our favourite politician should be Joe, our greatest general Bobs, and our dearest friend M or N, rather than Margarita or Naomi. Vera showed Lady Susan all the things that were best worth seeing in Genoa and the neighbourhood, and they lingered at Portofino, and other lovely nooks along that undulating coastline, garden villages dipping their edges into the blue water, and flushed with the pink glory of blossoming peach trees, raining light petals upon the young grass. It was the loveliest season of the Italian spring, and all along their way the world was glad with flowers. They missed nothing but the birds that were making grey old England glad before the flowers, but which here had been sacrificed to the young Italian's idea of sport. There was only one spot to which Veera went alone, and that was Mario Provana's grave. Happily, Susan had forgotten that he was buried at San Marco, and she wondered that Veera should have arranged to break the journey and stop a night at a place where there was absolutely nothing to see. Certainly it was not very far from Genoa, but a slow train and a headache made the journey seem an eternity to the impatient Susan, and when San Marco came she was very glad of her dinner and bed, and to have her hair taken down after it had been hurting her all the way, and to no end, as she was utterly indifferent to the opinion of a couple of natives, the provincial Italian being no more to her than a red-skinned son of the Five Nations, or a New Zealander. Veera was able to spend an hour in the yew tree enclosure in the morning freshness, between 6 and 7. She had telegraphed her order for 100 white roses to the San Marco florist the day before, and the flowers were ready for her in a light, spacious basket in the hall of the hotel when she came downstairs in the dim sunrise. "It is the last time," she said to herself, as she covered the great marble slab with her roses and stooped to lay cold lips on the cold stone. "Julia, Mario," she murmured tenderly, with lingering lips. "I am not afraid," she said to herself. "I know that he has forgiven me." Maid and footman and luggage went by the morning train, and half an hour after Veera and her friend left San Marco in a carriage that was to take them to Ventimiglia. By this means they had the drive in the morning sunshine, and escaped the long wait at the frontier, only entering the dismal station 5 minutes before their train left Italy. They spent that night in Marseille, where Susan Amphlett insisted upon seeing the Canebière by lamplight, and they were in Paris on the following evening, and in London the next day. "And now you are going to begin a splendid season," said Susie, "in this dear old house. The rooms look mere pigeonholes after your Roman villa, but there is no place like London, and I really think Claude is right. The Villa Provana is much too big, and just a wee bit eerie. It suggests ghosts, if one does not see them. One of those sweet young Bersaglieri told me that your husband's father made a man fight a duel to the death with him in one of those weird upper rooms, and that the stamping of their feet and the rattle of their rapiers is heard at 2:15 on every 15th of November. When I heard the story I felt rather glad I did not come to you till December. Aren't you pleased to be home, Veera, in these cosy drawing-rooms?" Everything in life is a question of contrast, and after the Villa Provana the drawing-room in Portland Place, with its 5 long windows and perspective of other drawing-rooms through a curtained archway, looked as snug as a suburban parlour. "Aren't you glad to be home?" persisted Susan. "No, Susie, I would rather have spent the rest of my life in Italy." "Oh, I suppose you prefer the climate. You are one of those people who care about the state of the sky. I don't. I like people, and shops, and theatres, and the opera at Covent Garden. Milan or Naples may be the proper place for music, but we get all the best singers. Don't think me ungrateful, Veera. I revelled in Rome, a place where one can go, from buying gloves and fans in the Corso to gloating over the circus where the Christian martyrs fought with lions, must be full of charm for anybody with a mind. Rome made a student of me. I read 2 historical primers and a novel of Marion Crawford's, besides dipping into Augustus Hare's delightful books. I haven't been so studious since I attended the Cambridge Extension lectures with my poor old governess, who used to amuse us by going to sleep and giving herself away by nodding. Her poor old bonnet used to waggle till it made even the lecturer laugh. Susie went off to join Mr. Amphlett in Northamptonshire, but she was to establish herself at the little house in Green Street directly after Easter, and then she and her dearest V must spend their lives together. Vera was not sorry to speed the parting guest. She had had rather too much of Susie in that month of Rome, for though she had lived her own life in a great measure, there was always the sense that Susie was there, and that she ought to give more of her time to her friend. She had suffered one grief in coming to London, for on landing at Dover she had to part with the Irish terrier, who was led off by a famous dog doctor's subordinate to spend 6 months in isolation, which was to be made as pleasant to him as such imprisonment could be made to an intelligent dog, warmly attached to a mistress who had raised him from the canine to the human by her companionship. Boroo was to pass 6 months in quarantine before he could stretch himself on the prayer rug at his mistress' feet and roll upon his back in an ecstasy of contentment. Boroo might be made comfortable in the retreat as one of the favourites of fortune, but Boroo would not be happy without his mistress, and the first telephonic communication from the Canine Hotel informed Mrs. Rutherford that her faithful friend had refused food and was very restless. The functionary who gave this information assured her that this was only a passing phase in dog life, and that the terrier would be happier next day. And the account next day was comparatively cheerful. The terrier had eaten a little sheep's head and was livelier. Vera hated the law which deprived her of the only friend who had comforted her in hours of deepest dejection. The dog's welcome after every parting, the dog's abounding love, had given a new zest to life. Was there any other love left to her now quite as real as this? Her husband, her enthusiastic friend Susan, all the train of affectionate aunts and cousins, the girl cousins who came to her to relate their love affairs, the baby cousins who kissed her when their nurses told them, holding up cherry lips and smiling with sweet blue eyes. 3 generations of Disbrowes. Was there one among them all whose love she could believe in as she could in her Irish terrier? 6 months without Boroo. It was a dreary time to think of. Boroo was the only creature who could take her mind away from herself and her life's history. He had given her the beatitude of loving and being loved, without romance, without passion, without looking before or after, and realizing the difference this dumb creature made, she could but think with melancholy longing of what a child would have meant in her life. And now began the familiar round in the familiar house, with the Disbrowes gathering strong as of old to help and to suggest, to bring to Vera's parties the few great people who had not yet discovered that a Mrs. Rutherford whose wealth had come out of the city could be so particularly attractive, or could give parties that always had a touch of originality that made them worth one's while. These mighty ones told each other that it was the absence of conventionality that made Vera's house so agreeable, while Lady Susan, still playing her part of chorus, told the mighty ones that it was because her cousin was a poet's daughter and made an atmosphere of poetry round her. "Vera lives in a world of dreams," she said, "and we are all dreamers, though the horrid everyday world comes between us and our fairest visions. I think that's why we love her." A princess of the blood royal happened to meet Veera at this time, and became one of her most ardent admirers, lunching or dining in Portland Place at least once a week, and visiting Mrs. Rutherford in her opera box. She had heard of the Roman villa and the Roman parties. "I shall spend next January in Rome on purpose to see more of you," she said, upon which Claude, who was present, begged that Her Royal Highness would make the Villa Provana her home whenever she came to the Eternal City, an invitation which Her Royal Highness graciously promised to remember. "My sweet girl, you are on the crest of the wave," Lady Okehampton told her niece. "You were never so much the fashion as this year. You ought to be proud of your social success." "I wish I had my dog out of quarantine," was all Vera said. "Get another dog, Pekingese lion, ever so much smarter than your rough brute." The season wore through somehow in perpetual gaieties, which the wife hated, but which were essential to the husband's well-being. He had all the racing world, and never missed an important meeting, but when there was no racing he wanted dinner parties or crowded evenings, abroad or at home. Later there would be Cowes, where he had a new yacht just out of the builder's yard, waiting to beat every boat in the Channel. He did not often look at his wife's visiting list, being content to give her the names of the men who were to be asked to her dinners, taking it for granted that they would be asked. Every evening party was more or less an omnium gatherum, and about these he asked no questions. But more than once, between March and June, he had suggested that Mrs. Bellenden should be invited to dinner, to some smallish semi-literary and artistic dinner. And this suggestion being ignored, he had advised her being included in one of the big dinner parties, where the mighty ones had been bidden to meet the royal princess. "I don't think that would do," Vera answered coldly. "You forget that Mrs. Bellenden is one of the handsomest women in London," Claude answered with some touch of temper, "and that people like to meet a well-known beauty." "I'm afraid Mrs. Bellenden is rather too well known. You had better give a dinner at Claridge's or the Ritz, Claude, and let Susan do hostess for you. Susie would enjoy it." "I suppose it will come to that," said Claude. "I'll take one of your Wagner nights when I know you'll be happy." Lady Susan, having warned her friend against the siren, was not so disloyal as to play hostess at a Bohemian dinner. "No, Claude," she said when the idea was mooted. "I've never been prudish, but I draw the line at Mrs. Bellenden." Her cousin shrugged his shoulders and left the room with a snatch of a French chanson, which was his most forcible expression of temper. The light tenor voice, the gay French verse, harmonized with the nature in which there were no depths. Goodwood was once more imminent, and Cowes was in the near future, when Vera sent out cards for her last evening party, which would be one of the last of the season, on the eve of the exodus of smart London. The Princess Hermione was to be at the party, and this royal lady was like that more famous heroine of the nursery who rode her white horse to Banbury Cross in a musical ride, for, like that famous lady, the princess expected to have music wherever she went. Music, and of the best, for the royal Hermione was a connoisseur, and herself no mean performer on the violoncello. A famous baritone and an equally famous mezzo-soprano were to sing during the evening, in the inner drawing-room, not in a formal way with programmes and seats for people to be packed in rows, to sit there from start to finish till, in our elegant 20th century English, they were fed up with squalling. Everything was to be informal, and the people who did not want music would have space enough in the larger rooms and on the staircase to babble and to flirt as they chose, while that inner drawing-room would be, as it were, a sanctuary for the elect, a temple of the god of harmony. Vera stood at the door of the larger drawing-room receiving her guests, from 10 to 1/2 when the Princess Hermione, who had just arrived, put her arm through her hostess's and asked eagerly, "Did you get him?" Signor Pergolesi, the baritone, understood. "Yes, ma'am. He is in the little drawing-room with Madame Rondolana, waiting to sing to you." "Take me there this moment, Vera." And hooked by the royal arm in a crumpled glove, Vera led the princess and her lady-in-waiting through the babbling crowd to the sanctuary where the elect were beginning to bore each other while they waited for the first song. Herr Mainz was at the piano ready to accompany the two singers whose engagement he had negotiated. At all concerts of this clever gentleman's arranging, it seemed to some people as if the artists were puppets, and that he pulled the string that set them going all through the performance. Tonight, however, there was to be less string-pulling and more sans façon, or rather it was Princess Hermione who was to pull the string. She certainly lost no time in telling Madame Rondolana what she wanted her to sing, and she kept that brilliant vocalist rolling out song after song in the rich abundance of a mezzo-soprano that nothing could tire. She sang song after song at the princess's nod, Italian, German, Swedish, nay, even English, with an ease that testified to power without limit. The baritone looked and listened with languid interest, not offended, for he knew that his turn would come, and that when once the princess started him, she would never let him leave off. He sat near the piano in an easy attitude, not listening, but turning his thoughts inward, and making up his mind as to what songs he would sing. Wagner? Yes. Bizet? Yes, but in any case, Die beiden Grenadiers as a finish, and then those massive folding doors that were shutting out the babblers should be flung wide open, and he would sing to the whole of the company. He could stop their talking. Those two grenadiers were infallible. "With that song I always knock them in the old Kent Road," he used to tell his friends. At 11 o'clock there came a kind of subtle sense of something wanting, even beyond that exquisite music, and Lady Okehampton whispered to her niece that it was time the princess went to supper, and that Claude must take her downstairs. Vera went in search of him. The crowd in the biggest drawing-room had thinned, and she was able to look for her husband, but without success, and she went through the other rooms to the spacious landing, in which direction most people were drifting, and there she met a perturbed spirit in the form of Susan Amphlett. "What's the matter, Susie? Is there anything wrong?" "Wrong?" cried Susie. "I call it simply disgusting. How could you be such a fool?" "What have I done?" "To ask that horrid woman! And with your princess for the guest of the evening. She ain't prudish, but I fancy she'll think it a bit steep to find herself rubbing shoulders with Mrs. Bellenden." "I have not invited Mrs. Bellenden." "Someone else has, then. Well, she has come like the lady at Cannes, invitée ou non." "Is Mrs. Bellenden here?" "Yes, in the supper-room in a mob of admirers. Claude took her down to supper." "That's rather tiresome," Vera answered quietly, "for he ought to take the princess, and I can't keep her waiting. Do be kind, Susie, and go and tell him he must come to the music-room this minute. The princess ought to have gone down before anybody, and now you say there's a mob." "A perfect bear-garden of greedy beasts. I don't believe there'll be an ortolan left by the time she comes. Anyhow, I'll make it hot for Claude." And Susie hurried off, elbowing a desperate way through the crowd on the stairs. "Mon Dieu, quelle foire!" she muttered. Vera went back to the sanctuary, impounding her Uncle Okehampton on the way, in case she found the friendly Hermione indisposed to wait for her host. She found her princess with a dark and angry brow, standing near the door, whispering to her attendant lady. She had the look of a princess who had been almost waiting, and who did not like the sensation. She heard that Mr. Rutherford was making his way through the crowd to attend upon her, with an air of supreme indifference. "Lord Okehampton is one of my old friends," she said, and took his offered arm without looking at Vera. "Mr. Rutherford can bring Pauline," she said, as they moved away. Pauline was the lady-in-waiting, a colourless spinster of 37, who loved everything the princess loved, and hated everything she hated, and who dressed like the princess, only much worse. Lord Okehampton made himself vastly agreeable, and the mob, seeing the royal brow under the tiara, made way for the couple, and there was a table found for the royal lady in an agreeable position, and there were ortolans and peaches without stint. But when Claude came presently with the Honourable Pauline, he received a snub so unmistakable that he was glad to carry his honourable companion to the remotest corner of the room, where he gave her a sumptuous supper, and had the consolation of her sympathy. "The princess has a heart of gold," she told him, "but her temper is dreadful sometimes, and life is rather difficult with her." "Not quite a bed of roses," said Claude. "It would be ungrateful of me to call it a bed of stinging nettles," said Pauline, "because as there are 5 of us at home, all unmarried, I have to do something, and the princess is wonderfully kind, and then she is so clever and accomplished. She does everything well, but music is her passion." "That's how I made my mistake," said Claude. "I thought her enjoyment of her own particular baritone would have lasted longer, and that I should have been in attendance before she was inclined to move." "The princess has a good appetite," said Pauline, discussing her 4th ortolan, "and one really does get very hungry at an evening party. Music is so exhausting. I hope that dear Pergolesi and Madame Rondolana are having something." "Our good friend Mainz will take care of that." "Apropos," said Pauline, "there is a lady here I am rather curious about. We passed her on the stairs. Mrs. Bellenden, gloriously handsome and all that, but frankly, Mr. Rutherford, I was just a wee bit surprised to see her in your wife's house, especially to meet the princess. I hardly like to speak of such things, but has she not been just a little talked about lately? Of course I know she went everywhere 2 years ago, but just lately people have said things, and one has not run against her at the best houses." "Of course she has been talked about," answered Claude, with his frank laugh. "Meteors are talked about. A woman so exceptionally beautiful is like Halley's Comet. People are sure to talk about her, and the ill-natured talkers will make scandal about her. Poor Mrs. Bellenden! Quite a harmless person, I assure you. Open-hearted, generous, impulsive, a trifle imprudent perhaps, as these impulsive women always are." The lady-in-waiting had supped too well to be ill-natured. "I am so glad you have told me. I shall tell the princess that there is no foundation for any of the stories we have heard about poor Mrs. Bellenden," she said, as they left the supper-room. The sanctuary was full of people when Lord Okehampton took the princess back after a leisurely supper, during which they had talked over old friends and things that had happened a dozen years ago when Okehampton was master of the horse. The princess had recovered her temper and was ready to enjoy her favourite Pergolesi, but Vera, who had not left the music-room, looked white and weary, and the kindly Hermione chid her for not having followed her to the supper-room. All the best people were now gathered in the inner drawing-room, some for the princess and some for the baritone, and only the royal chair was vacant when the royal lady reappeared. Pergolesi chuckled at the thought that Rondolana had lavished her 1.5 of perfection on the chosen few, whilst he had all the finest tiaras and the largest display of shoulders and diamonds for his audience. Hermione beckoned him to her side, and they discussed what songs he should sing, she ordering, but he making her order what he wanted and had made up his mind about. "I should like to finish with Die beiden Grenadiers," he said in his broken English. "I think it is one of your favourites, madame?" "Je l'adore." Song after song was received with enthusiasm. Herr Mainz played a brilliant mazurka di salon, while the baritone rested and whispered with the princess, and when the silvery chimes of an Italian 8-day clock announced midnight, the great doors were thrown open and Pergolesi hurled his splendid voice upon the crowd in the outer room. A phrase or two, and the babble of 300 voices had become silence. And when the song was done, the crowd melted away, still in comparative stillness, while Vera stood on the landing to see them pass, as if she were holding a review. No one wanted to begin talking after that stupendous song. People had stayed later than they intended, till it was too late to go on to other and perhaps better houses. The princess had gone out by a second staircase, which had been kept clear for her, with Pergolesi and Oakhampton to escort her downstairs, and Claude Rutherford to put her into her carriage. She went off in a charming mood, but could not refrain from a stab at the last. "Your wife's party has been perfect," she said, "but the company just a little mixed. I suspect you of having introduced the Bohemian element in the shape of that handsome lady whom everybody has been talking about." There were lingerers after that, and the party was not over till 1 o'clock. The last guest strolled into the pale grey night as Big Ben tolled the first hour of day. Claude followed his wife up the broad staircase, where the heated atmosphere was heavy with the scent of arum lilies, and the daturas that hung their white bells in all the corners. She was moving slowly, tired and languid after the long evening, and she never looked back. He followed her to the door of her room, but she stopped upon the threshold, turned and faced him, ashy pale in her white gown, like a ghost. "Good-bye," she said with a face of stone. "Vera, for God's sake, what's the matter?" "Good-bye," she repeated, and, as he moved towards her, she drew back suddenly, so quickly that he was unprepared for the movement, and shut the door in his face. He heard the key turning in the lock, shrugged his shoulders, and walked slowly along the gallery to his own room, not the room that had been Mario Provana's dressing-room. "Some ass has been telling her things," he muttered to himself. And then he thought of Mrs. Bellenden's appearance that night, in a gown of gold tissue and a diamond tiara. She had been too insolently splendid in her overweening beauty, too tremendous, too suggestive of Cleopatra at Actium, a woman who lived upon the ruin of men. What wife, who cared for her husband, could help being angry if she saw him near such a creature? And he had been near her all the night. He had whispered with her in corners, hung over her perfumed shoulders, followed her close as her shadow, sat with her in a nest of tropical flowers in the balcony, instead of moving about among his guests. He had taken her down to the supper-room, first among the first, neglecting duchesses and a princess of the blood royal for her sake. No doubt that malicious little wretch Susan Amphlett had been watching him, and had reported all his misdoings to Vera. "What does it matter?" he said to himself. "My life was growing unbearable. The gloom was closing round me like a funeral pall. Kate was my only refuge. I have never been in love with her, but she stops me from thinking." That was the secret. Mrs. Bellenden had been his Nepenthe, when the common round of pleasures had lost their power to make him forget. Mrs. Bellenden was like strong drink, like opium or hashish. She killed thought. She filled the vacant spaces in his life, the Stygian swamps where black thoughts wandered in space like angry devils. Her exactions, her quarrels, their partings and reunions, the agitations and turmoil of her existence had filled his life. When he banged the hall door of the bijou house in Brown Street behind him after one of their stormy farewells, he knew that he would go back to her in a week. He tramped the adjacent park, across and across, along and along in a fury, and thanked God that he had done with that harpy. But he knew that he would have to go back to the harpy, to be reconciled again, with oaths and kisses and tears, and to quarrel again, and to obey her orders, and go here or there as she made him. The most degrading slavery to a wicked woman was better than the great silent house and the horror that inhabited it. His wife had her consolations, nay, even her hysterical delights. She could shut herself in her white temple with the spirits of her worshipped dead. She heard voices. Death now hardly counted with her, neither death nor time. St. Francis of Assisi was as near her as Robert Browning. Shakespeare was no more remote than Henry Irving. She was mad. The emptiness, the silence, the gloom were killing him. If there had been children, all might have been different. The past would have been forgotten in those new and forward-looking lives. His sons and daughters would not have let him remember past things. And Vera would not have had time for morbid thoughts, for nursing dark memories. Her children would have made her forget. He had some kind of explanation with her on the day after the party, and made some feeble kind of apology. But she was cold and dumb. She expressed no anger, neither complained nor reproached him. She shed no tears. She stood before him in her white silence, still beautiful, but with a pale, unearthly beauty that chilled his heart. All the force of the old love swept back upon him, and his heart ached with a passion of pity and regret. He seized her by the shoulders, so frail, so wasted since last year, and looked at her with despairing eyes. "Vera, you are killing yourself by inches. What can I do? What can I do for you? Shall we go away, ever so far away, to new worlds, to places where the stupendous phenomena of nature and the things that men have made will take us out of ourselves? There are things in this world so tremendous that they can kill thought. The Zambesi, the Aztec cities of Mexico, the Great Wall of China." "You are very good," she answered, coldly but not unkindly, rather with a weary indifference, as of a soul too tired to feel or think. "I am quite contented here. My life in this house suits me as well as any life could." "In this house?" he cried. "Yes, in this house. I am not alone here. But I don't want to keep you here if the house makes you unhappy. You had better go away, Claude. Go anywhere you like, as you like. I shall not complain." "Are you giving me a letter of licence?" he asked, with a harsh laugh. "Is your love quite dead?" "Everything is dead," she answered. He could get no more from her, and he left her in anger. "You had better divorce me and marry Francis Symeon," he said, "and cultivate spookism together." The natural sequel to a scene like that was a little dinner at Claridge's with Mrs. Bellenden, and an evening at the silliest musical comedy to be seen and heard in London. His wife had given him a letter of licence. She had ceased to love him. He made himself so disagreeable to Mrs. Bellenden by dinner-time that the meal was eaten in sullen silence, and the magnum of Veuve Pomeroy was hardly enough for two, for when Mrs. Bellenden was in a rage, her glass had to be filled very often, and the waiters at the smart hotels knew her ways. The waiters worshipped her. "She tips as handsome as she tipples," had been said of her by one of them. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 29. Everything was dead. That had been Vera's answer when Claude asked despairingly if love was dead. The words were in her mind now as she stood alone in the room where her poets and her actors and her philosophers looked at her from the white walls, and where the sound of the great hall door closing heavily as her husband shut it behind him was still in her ears. Had he gone for ever? Was it indeed the end? Could love that had begun in ecstasy close in this grey calm? She felt neither sorrow nor anger. Everything was dead. She stood among the ruins of her life, feeling as a child might feel when the house she has built of cards shatters suddenly and falls at her feet. Everything was over. She had no thought of building another house, no desire to patch up a broken life and begin again. Perhaps her husband loved her still, and it was the gloom of this haunted house that had driven him to seek distraction in a baser love. It was her fault, perhaps, and she ought to be sorry for him. Poor Claude. She remembered his gaiety, the airy mockery that had enchanted her, the quick wit that had struck fire and light out of dull things. She remembered the joyous nature, the light laughter, the inexhaustible energy which made difficult things in the way of sport seem easy. Yes, they had been happy, utterly happy in the life of the moment, shutting out every thought that was irksome, every memory that hurt. And it was all over and dead, and she had nothing left but the shadows in this room, the dead faces, the words of those who were not. That scriptural phrase had always moved her. He was not. Her afternoons in Mr. Symeon's library had been all she had cared for in the season that was ending. She had gone wherever her husband asked her to go, and had given the entertainments he wanted her to give, but through all that brilliant summer she had gone about like a corpse alive. That dreary simile had been in her mind sometimes when she thought of herself sitting in her victoria, dressed as only the well-bred English woman with unlimited money can be dressed, lovely in her fragile fairness, admired and talked about. She had gone about and held her own in a quiet way among crowds of clever men and women, and her life had seemed to her like the end of a long dream. Her only vital interest had been in the voices she heard in Francis Symeon's shadowy room. Those voices were of living men and women, but the words were the words of the dead. She was not utterly unhappy. The past was past, and she had left off grieving over it, for now she had a transcendent hope in the near future, the hope of death. She would soon have passed the river that they had passed, Giulia and her father, the gate through which they had gone to a higher stage in the upward path of life would open for her, and no matter by what slow ascent, no matter with what feeble steps, she would climb the mountain up which they had gone, those emancipated spirits. She had known for a long time that she was marked for death. She had no specific ailment, but in this last season she had felt her vanishing life, felt the painless ebb of vitality, and had measured by a flight of stairs, by a pathway in the park, where she walked sometimes in the early morning, the waning strength of limbs and heart. The dreadful sleeplessness of the first year of her widowhood had returned, and her nights were almost entirely spent in thought and reading, her brain never resting, her heart seldom quiet. Although she looked forward to death as release, she could not escape the boredom of medical treatment. Lady Okehampton, whose daughters were all married and wanted nothing from parental affection, except to be allowed to go their own way and not to be obliged to invite Mummy to their choicest parties, devoted herself more and more to her favourite niece, who wasn't actually her niece, but only a first cousin once removed. Since, in those last days at Disbrowe, she had seen the mark of death on Vera's pale forehead, Aunt Mildred, who was really a warm-hearted woman, had interested herself keenly in the vanishing life, and had made unremitting efforts to combat the enemy. "She has simply wasted her life since her second marriage," she said. "She has wasted her life as recklessly as Claude has wasted her money. But she shan't die without my making an effort to save her, even if I have to take every specialist in London to Portland Place." "You'd better take her to the specialist," said his lordship. "It would save your time and her money." "As if money mattered. You could telephone for appointments and do the whole of Grosvenor Street and Savile Row in a morning with a good taxi." "A taxi when my niece has two superb Daimlers? No, by the by, the last Claude showed me is an SCAT." "Poor Provana," sighed Okehampton, "to think that nothing could induce him to buy a motor car, although he was a man to whom moments are money. It was one of his few eccentricities to worship his horses." "He might have been here now if he had not been quite so fussy about his horses," sighed her ladyship. "What do you mean?" "He might not have used the door between the house and the stables, the door by which he and his murderer came into the house on that awful night." "True," assented her husband. "It was an infernally unlucky door, and I suppose if poor little Vera dies, they'll carry her out that way to be cremated." "Okehampton, you are too bad. Whoever said she was to be cremated?" "Nobody, but it's the modern way, isn't it? And of course everything would be up to date." "How can you be so heartless, and how can you use that odious expression, up to date?" "Well, I hope the poor girl will be warned in time and live to make old bones, but she didn't look like it at her last party. You'd better give her husband a good wigging. It will be more useful than calling in the specialists." "I am utterly disgusted with Claude. He is throwing her money out of windows, and behaving atrociously into the bargain." "I suppose you mean Mrs. Bellenden. Well, my dear, that was bound to come. Vera has been too much in the clouds for the last year. From what Susan Amphlett told me of her way of life in Rome, she was bound to lose her husband. No man can stomach neglect from a wife, unless all the other women neglect him, and Claude Rutherford is not a negligible quantity." Lady Okehampton had tried her hand upon her young kinsman before this colloquy with her lord, and had found him hopeless. He turned the point of her lectures with a jest. He was light as vanity. He protested that his wife was alone to blame. He adored her, and thought no other woman upon this planet her equal in charm and beauty. But since she had taken up with Symeon and his spooks, she had surrounded herself with an atmosphere of sadness that would send the most devoted husband to the primrose path, in sheer revolt against the gloom of his house. "We are poor creatures," he said, "and we have to be amused." Once only in the course of numerous wiggings did Claude show anything like strong feeling, and then emotion came in a tempest that scared his mild kinswoman. She had talked to him about his wife's health. "Vera is absolutely wasting away," she said. "Something must be done, or she will not live till the end of the year." "No, no, no," he cried. "My God, what do you mean? Is that to be the end? Is death to take her from me and leave me in this black world alone? You have no right to say such a thing. By what authority? Who has told you that she is in failing health? I see her every day. She never complains." "You must be blind if you don't see the change in her." "I don't believe there is anything seriously wrong. She is as lovely as ever. No, I don't believe it. You are cruel to come here and frighten me. She is all I have in the world. All. Do you understand?" His head drooped suddenly upon the table by which he was sitting, and she heard his hoarse sobs tearing his throat and chest, and saw his long thin fingers writhing among his hair, the boyish auburn hair with a glint of gold in it that foolish women had praised. "There is no need for despair, Claude. I only wanted to awaken you to the seriousness of the case. We shall save her, in spite of herself. I see you are still fond of her, and yet I have been a brute, a senseless, idiotic beast. But that's all over. Lady Okehampton, I love her. I would lie outside her door like that dog of hers, all through the long night, only to get a smile and a touch of her hand in the morning. Love her! I loved her for 5 patient years, loved her passionately, and kept myself in check, and behaved like an elder brother, I, the man no woman could trust. Love her! The picture of her childish prettiness at Disbrowe was in my memory when I was going to the devil at Simla. You don't know what men are made of. You only know the model English gentleman, like your husband. Okehampton has never given me any trouble, except in his young days, when he used to ride dangerous horses. I know I've been exceptionally fortunate in my husband, and of course I know that modern husbands and wives are utterly unlike us. But I must say that your behaviour at your wife's last party was inexcusable. The dear princess was sadly huffed, and I doubt if Vera will ever get her to her house again." "I don't think Vera will try." "But she ought to try. The Princess Hermione has been perfectly sweet about her." "Vera doesn't care. That's her worst symptom, that I know of. She has left off caring about things." "And that is a very bad symptom," said Lady Okehampton. "When Chagford's wife showed signs of it, I bundled her off to a nursing home for 6 weeks, and she came out of it just in time for Ascot, and as keen as mustard, as Chagford said in his vulgar way. She had been dieted and massaged, and not allowed to see anyone but her nurses, and she was quite cured of not caring. She romped with her children, and ate jam pudding like one of them." "Ah, you see, there were children," sighed Claude. "There was something for her to come back to. Vera and you ought to have had a family. It is very disappointing," said Aunt Mildred, and the tone implied that when she said disappointing she meant reprehensible. "Never mind," she went on presently, in a more hopeful tone. "Don't be downhearted, Claude. If doctors can cure her, she shall be another woman before the end of the year." "You love doctors much better than I do," said Claude, grasping her hands. "Find the man who can cure her, and I will worship him." After this Vera entered upon a wide acquaintance with the fashionable specialists, the man who was invincible in treatment of lung trouble, the only authority upon cardiac disorders, the man who knew more about the nervous system than any other physician in Europe, the man who had given his life to the study of the digestive organs, the hypnotic doctor, and the mesmerist, and finally, as a condescension, the all-round or common-sense man, who might be consulted about anything, and sometimes, as it were, by rule of thumb, succeeded where the specialists had failed. These gentlemen came to Portland Place at irregular intervals through the month of August, Vera resolutely refusing to leave London in that impossible month, and Lady Okehampton again sacrificing her annual cure to the care of her niece, as she had done in the year of Mario Provana's unhappy death. Lady Okehampton, having made this sacrifice, almost the greatest which a woman of her age and position could make, naturally allowed herself some slight compensation in fussiness. She talked about her niece's health to boring point with her familiar friends, with the result of booking the name and address of some infallible specialist hitherto unknown to her, and this accounted for the spasmodic appearance of a new consultant once or twice a week in Vera's morning room, all through that impossible month in which the doctors themselves were panting for escape from London, to shoot grouse in Scotland, or do their own cures in Bohemia after a season of hard dining. Vera was curiously submissive to these frequent ordeals. She answered any questions that the great man asked her, but she never volunteered information about herself, and she always made light of her ailments. The admission of a little worrying cough that was at its worst at night, a slight palpitation of the heart after going upstairs, was all that could be obtained from her by the most subtle questionings. But lungs and heart told their own story without words. She smiled when the nerve specialist asked if she slept well, and again when he suggested certain harmless opiates which would ensure beneficent slumber. She had taken them all. She had exhausted Susan Amphlet's pharmacopoeia, which contained all these specifics and others not so harmless. When one physician after another, for on this they were all agreed, told her that she ought not to be in London in this sultry, depressing weather, while each advised his pet health resort, she smiled sweetly and said she meant to remain in London till November, when she would go back to Rome. "I am fond of this house," she said, "and the London air suits me." "London air is very good air," answered Dr. Selwyn Tower, who understood her better than the various new lights, "but not in August and September. If you are to be in Rome in November, why not spend the interval in Italy, at Varese, for instance, a charming spot with every advantage?" No, Vera was not to be persuaded. "I like the quiet of this house after the season. All I want is rest and silence," she said, and Dr. Selwyn Tower shot a despairing glance at Lady Okehampton. "Your niece is absolutely charming, but as obstinate as a mule," he told her, when they had their conference in one of the drawing-rooms. All the doors and portières were open, and the doctor looked at the long vista of splendid emptiness with a faint shudder. "It is a fine house, but a little depressing," he murmured. "I call it positively uncanny. But that is all in my niece's line. She is dreadfully morbid. I am glad there was no occultism or Christian Science when I was young." At these words, Christian Science, the famous consultant, shuddered worse than at sight of the empty rooms. "If your sweet niece is that way inclined, we can do nothing for her," he said. "No, thank heaven, that is not one of her fads." And then the fashionable physician gave his opinion of the case, or just so much of his opinion as he thought it good to give to an affectionate but not over-wise aunt. He found that the patient's strength was at a very low ebb. She had been wasting her resources, living upon her capital, refusing herself the rest that was essential for so fragile a form, so sensitive a temperament, and so over-active a brain. Lady Okehampton had told him of the gaieties, the rush from place to place, from amusement to amusement, the everlasting entertaining and being entertained, and he talked as if he had been there, watching and taking notes all through that wild career. He was not going to extinguish hope, so he kept up a cheerful tone throughout the conference. There was nothing heroic in the treatment required. Rest and a soothing regimen. Not much walking, but a great deal of fresh air, drives in her open carriage to rural suburbs if she should insist on remaining in London, a little quiet society, the utmost care as to diet, and constant medical supervision. He would be glad to confer with Mrs. Rutherford's regular medical man before he left London, and he hoped on his return in 3 or 4 weeks to find a marked improvement. This was all. When questioned as to lung trouble, he said that there was trouble, but he saw no fatal indications. Yes, there was heart weakness, but nothing that might not be modified by care. Simple as she was, Lady Okehampton did not feel altogether assured by all this bland talk, and the sound of the doctor's carriage wheels, as they rolled away from the door, recalled the moaning of the winter waves under the red cliffs at Disbrowe. She repeated the specialist's diplomatic utterances to Claude, who did not seem to attach much importance to medical opinion. "All doctors talk alike," he said. "I don't think Vera's is a case for the faculty. You remember what Macbeth said to his physician?" Lady Okehampton did not remember, but she gave a sigh of assent that answered as well. "I'm afraid Vera's is a rooted sorrow, and God help me, I cannot pluck it from her memory. We had better leave her alone. We can do nothing more for her. We can't make her happy." "Claude, this is too dreadful. Are we to let her die?" cried Aunt Mildred, with something like an elderly shriek. "Is death so great an evil? At least it means rest, and there are some of us who can get rest no other way." "Claude, it is positively dreadful to hear you talk like that, as if you cared for nothing in this life." "I don't." And then Lady Okehampton took him in hand severely, and talked to him as a good woman, but as a Philistine of the Philistines would naturally talk on such an occasion, and after remonstrating with him for his want of religious feeling, and even proper affection, went on to reproaching him for spending his wife's money, squandering her magnificent fortune with a reckless wastefulness that might end in reducing her to beggary. "No fear of that, Aunt Mildred. No doubt I have thrown money out of windows. Money has never been a serious consideration with Vera and me. We should have been quite as happy when we started on our Venetian honeymoon if we had had only just enough to pay for our tourist tickets and our gondola, just enough for the gondola and a cheap hotel. Money could buy us nothing that we cared for. Later, when I knew what her income was, I spent with a free hand, but there's a good deal of spending in 100,000 a year." Lady Okehampton shivered and stirred in her seat uneasily. That colossal income, and nothing done for the needy members of her husband's illustrious house. "I wanted to amuse myself and to amuse my wife, and amusements are costly nowadays, so the money has run out pretty fast, but there has always been a handsome surplus. I see Mr. Zabulon, the banker, one of my wife's trustees, 2 or 3 times a year, and he has never complained. Vera's charities are immense, so there's really nothing for you to moan about, Lady Okehampton." "Nothing!" cried Vera's aunt, with uplifted hands. "Was there ever anyone so feather-headed, so feckless? Can you forget that when your wife dies her fortune dies with her?" "No, but when she dies I shall have done with all that money can buy. I shall be able to pension the old stable hands and provide for my dogs out of my 1,500 a year, and I can give my trainer half a dozen cracks that will make him comfortable for life." "You are very considerate about your stable and kennels. I wonder if you have ever considered Vera's obligations to those who come after her." "If you mean the Roman cater cousins, I certainly have not." "Provana's heirs? Why, of course not. They will be inordinately rich when that splendid fortune is chopped up among them. No, Claude, if you had a proper family feeling, which to my mind is an essential element in the Christian life, you would have thought of our herd of poor relations, Nicholas Disbrowe, dying by inches in an East Anglian vicarage, and not daring to winter in the South for want of means; or poor Lady Rosalba, who is no better off than Vera's grandmother, and doesn't make half as good a fight as poor Lady Felicia did; or Mary Disbrowe Jones, who married so wretchedly and is selling blouses in a shabby street in Pimlico. I think Vera has done a lot for all of 'em. I know she sent the Reverend Nicholas £1,000 last winter when his wife wrote her a doleful letter, and she gave her blouse-making cousin £250 last week to save her from bankruptcy. Consider them, forsooth. Do you suppose they don't ask to be considered? Every man jack of them, down to the remotest connection by marriage. They are as eloquent with the pen as professional begging letter writers. They blister their papers with tears, and Vera never refuses. She does not know how. Oh, I know she is generous. 1,000 to that worthy man in the Fens was handsome, but that kind of casual help won't provide for the future, and when our poor dear is gone there will be nothing. May that sad day be long, long off, but in the meantime she ought to invest her surplus income and leave it to those who want it most and would use it best. You may be sure I have no personal feeling, but the best of us are not too well off, and if there should come the general election that we are threatened with, I doubt if Chagford will be able to stand for North Devon. The ballot has made bribery more audacious and more expensive than ever. I am told 3 half-crowns is the least the wretches will take. They will ride a candidate's motor to death, and then go and vote for his opponent. "Let Chagford talk to my wife if there's a dissolution," said Claude, with a half-smothered yawn that expressed weariness and disgust. "Vera is always kind," sighed Lady Okehampton dolefully, but she refrained from suggesting that, when the dissolution came, Vera might not be there. This was Aunt Mildred's last attack upon Claude Rutherford. He took matters into his own hands after this, and no longer depended upon accounts of his wife's health at second hand. He took all information upon that subject from Dr. Selwyn Tower, who had a great reputation at that period, and whom he was inclined to trust. The physician was more frank with the husband than he had been with the aunt, though even yet he said nothing to extinguish hope. He told Mr. Rutherford that it would have been better for his wife to winter in the south, or by way of experiment to try a short winter in the Engadine, coming down to Ragaz before the snow melted. But as the dear lady seemed strangely bent upon staying in her own house, it would be safer to indulge her fancy. Lungs and heart were only a question of weakness. The mind was of serious consequence, and everything must be done to check the tendency to melancholia. "If we can make her happy, we shall be able to deal with the lung trouble," said the physician. "Open air and good spirits might work a miracle." Dr. Tower naturally inquired as to parental history, and was somewhat disheartened on hearing that the dear lady's father and mother had died young, the former of galloping consumption during an open-air cure. Yet even this did not induce him to pronounce sentence of death, nor did he allow Mrs. Rutherford to suppose herself a desperate case, though he insisted on having a trained nurse, and of the best, in attendance upon his patient, as well as the maid Louison. The French girl might be all that Mrs. Rutherford could require, he admitted, when Vera told him she wanted no one else. "But you must allow me what I want," pleaded Dr. Tower, with his most ingratiating air. "My treatment is of the mildest, nothing heroic or troublesome about it, but I must be sure that it is followed. I must have someone about you who is responsible to me. My nurse shall not be allowed to bore you. If she is intrusive or disagreeable to you, you can telephone to me, and she shall be superseded within the hour." Vera submitted. Her indifference to most things, even to those that concerned herself, was one of her symptoms, which made Dr. Tower uneasy. "This woman will never help to cure herself," he thought, as he drove away, with that far-off look in Vera's face impressed upon his mind. "She does not want to get well. She is not absolutely unhappy, only indifferent. Something must have gone wrong in her life. Yet her husband does not seem a bad sort." She was not unhappy. She had been allowed to take her own way, and to live as she wished to live, in the silence and peace of the spacious house, where the business of entertaining seemed to be at an end for ever. Whatever had been amiss in the life that was ebbing away seemed hardly to matter, now that she was drawing near the other life. Her husband came and went, and spent a good deal of time in a room talking with her, or reading to her when she was too tired to talk. There had been nothing said of his offence against her, no utterance of that other woman's name. They were friends again, and could talk of the things that they loved, literature, music, art, of Henry Irving's Hamlet, of Millais and Browning, both of whom she had seen at Aunt Mildred's house in her childhood, and whose faces she remembered, of books new and old. They were as friendly and sympathetic as they had been in Mario Provana's lifetime, before the dawn of love. It was as if they were still at the same platonic stage. All that had come after was like a lurid dream from which they had awakened. Tristram was again the true knight. Iseult was sinless. All that was best in Claude Rutherford was in the ascendant during these long, slow weeks of silent sorrow, in which he knew that the man with the scythe was at the door, that nothing money could buy or love devise could save the woman he loved. He had broken finally with that other woman, finally, for the fiery cup had lost its intoxicating power, and the end had been a vulgar quarrel about money. Whatever was to happen to him, he was safe from that siren's spells. All his natural sweetness, his sympathy and charm, were for Vera in those quiet weeks of September and October, when there was nobody in London, and the chariot wheels rolled no more in the broad roadway. He was at his best in his wife's white morning-room, where the faces of the immortals looked down upon him, and where he was kind even to the dog she loved, the Irish terrier brought home after his half-year's quarantine, who stretched his strong limbs and rough red-brown body against her satin slippers, as she lay on her sofa, a fragile figure shadowy in her loose white gown. All that was best in this man, the tenderness, the sympathy, was in evidence now. A failure, no doubt, trivial and shallow, incapable of deep feeling perhaps, but a sweet, lovable nature, a nature that had made women love him, whether he wanted their love or not. "It is very good of you to give me so much of your time," Vera said one day, slipping her thin little hand into his, which was almost as thin. "Invalids are wretched company, and I don't want you to have too much of this dull room." "I do not find it dull, and it is no duller for me than for you." "It is never dull for me. I have my faces. They are always company." "Your faces? You mean those portraits?" "Byron, Scott, Browning. Yes, they are always company. I've looked at them till they are alive. I've read Walter Scott's journals and Byron's letters till I know them as well as if they had been my intimate friends when they were alive. I know Browning's letters by heart, those sweet letters to the sweet wife. Shakespeare is different. It is so sad that there are no familiar records. One can only think of him as the poet and the creator, genius that touches the supernatural." I don't think it matters how little you know of the man, his deer stalking or his tardy marriage, as long as you don't think there was no Shakespeare, and that the noblest poetry this world ever saw was written by the skunk who gave away his friend," said her husband. "Bacon? Horrible." On one quiet evening, when Claude had been with her since his solitary dinner, she said softly, "I sometimes forget all the years, and think you are just the same cousin Claude who took pity on me at Disbrowe, when I was so shy that other people's kindness only made me miserable. Till you came, I used to creep into any corner with a book rather than mix with my Disbrowe cousins, who were so dreadfully grand and clever. Precocious geniuses, Mrs. Somerville's in the bud, who matured into two of the most commonplace women I know, and almost as ignorant as Susan Amphlett," said Claude. "But you must not give me so much of your time, Claude," she said gently. "I love to be with you, but I may slip away for the Cambridgeshire," he said, the trivial side of his character coming to the surface. She did not even ask if he were personally interested in the race. There had been a time when she knew every horse he owned, and made most of them her friends, rejoicing in their beauty, as creatures whom she would have liked to keep for pets rather than to expose them to the ordeal of the turf, albeit she had followed their fortunes and speculated upon their chances, almost as keenly interested as her husband. But now they had become things without shape or meaning, like all the rest of the outside world. "You need not be afraid of leaving me," she said. "I have this good friend to keep me company," smoothing Boroo's rough coat with her soft hand. "I wish my mother was still in town. She would come to you every day." "She is very good, but she and I have never been really friends. I know she would be kind, but she would talk of painful things. I don't want to remember. I want to look forward." "Yes," he answered in a low voice, bending over her and pressing his lips on the pale brow. "There must be no looking back." It was the first time he had kissed her since the night of the concert. She looked up at him with a sad, sweet smile, and he held his hand in hers for a moment. "Susan must come to you every day to keep you in good spirits," he said. "No, Claude, Susie doesn't like sick people. She sits by my side and chatters, telling me all the scandals she thinks will interest me, but I can hear the effort she is making. Her tongue does not run on as it used before I was ill, and once when she saw a spot of blood on my handkerchief she nearly fainted. I don't want too much of Susie. Mr. Symeon will come and talk to me sometimes, and his talk always does me good." "I wish I could think so. I hate leaving you in London. You ought to have gone to Disbrowe, as your aunt wished. You would have done better in that soft air." "No, I should be better nowhere than in this silent house. If I cannot be in Rome, there is nowhere else where I should like to be. I want space and silence, and no going and coming of people who mean to be kind and who bore me to death. I want no fussing and talking about me. I can put up with my nurse, because she is quiet and does her work like a machine." Rome? Yes, in the November afternoons, when the world outside her windows was hidden in grey fog, she longed for the beautiful city, the place of life and light, the city of fountains, full of the sound of rushing water. The dull greyness of London oppressed her when she thought of the long garden walks in their solemn stillness, the cypress and ilex, the statues gleaming ghostly in the dusk against the dark walls of laurel and arbutus, the broad terrace with its massive marble balustrade, on which she had leant for hours in melancholy meditation, thinking, as the multitude of church towers and the great dome in the hollow below her changed from grey to purple, as the golden light died in the west and the young moon rose above the fading crimson of the afterglow. It was sad to think that she would never see that divine city again, and all that she had loved in Italy, Cadenabia, where her honeymoon had begun, to the sound of rippling water as the boats crept by in the darkness, to the music of guitars and Italian voices singing in the light of coloured lanterns, while the cosmopolitan crowd clustered in the narrow space between the hotel and the lake. Susan Amphlett came nearly every day and insisted upon being admitted. She had come to London for a week just to buy frocks for a winter round of visits. "But much more to see you, my dear," she said, and then she recited the houses to which she was going, and her reason for going to them, which seemed to be anything rather than any regard for the people she was visiting. She talked of herself as if she had been a star actress. "I'm touring in the shires this winter," she said. "I did Hants and Dorset last year and was bored to extinction. Roger is happy in any hole if he can be riding to hounds every day, and he had the Blackmoor Vale and the North Hants within his reach most of the time, while I was excruciated by a pack of women who talked of nothing but their good works or their bridge, and they were such poor players that the good works were less boring than the bridge talk. Dear Lady Sue, would you call no trumps if? And would you do this and t'other? Questions that babies in the nursery might ask over their toy cards." Then came a long account of the frocks that were being made for the shires, and the scarlet top-coat to be worn with the grey habit, which Roger hated. "I think he would like me in an early Victorian get-up, with the edge of my habit touching my horse's fetlocks, a large white muslin collar, and a low beaver hat with a long feather. Those early Victorian collars cost £2 or £3 apiece, my granny told me, and those poor wretches who never changed their clothes till dinner wore them all day long, and yet they talk of our extravagance, as if nobody paid anything for clothes in those days." And then when the houses to which she was going, and the clothes she was to wear, and her quarrels with her husband and her maid had been discussed at length, Susan began to talk about her friend. "Lady O told me how ill you had been, ma mia, and of your curious whim about this house. She says Selwyn Tower would have liked you to go to the Transvaal, and told her that 2 or 3 months in that delicious climate would make you a strong woman. But finding you set upon stopping in your own house, he gave way, as your illness is chiefly a question of nerves. It is a comfort to know that, n'est-ce pas, mein Schatz?" "Yes, of course it is a comfort. I suppose, with nothing amiss but one's nerves, one might live to be 90. "True, dearest, quite 90, Susan answered, shuddering. Susan Amphlett was out of her element in a sick room. The mere thought that the friend she was talking to was marked for death seemed to freeze her blood. Her own hand grew as cold as the cold hand she was holding. She could not be bright and pleasant with death in sight. As she sat with Vera in the library that had been Provana's favourite room, she felt as if there were someone standing behind the door in that inner room, a door that had been left ajar. There was someone waiting there, whose unseen presence made her dumb. Someone, not Provana, but another and more terrible shape. "Vera," she burst out at last, "why do you sit in this horrid room instead of in your sweet white den, with Byron and Browning and all your dear people? I like this room better now that my thoughts have gone backwards." "What can you mean by thoughts going backward?" "Now that I know time is measured for me, so much and no more, I like to live over the days that are gone. It spins out my life to live the dead years over again. This is the room Mario loved. His books are on those shelves, the books that opened a new world for me, the Italian historians, the Italian poets. In the first year of our life in this house, before I was the fashion, we used to sit here of an evening, long evenings, from 9 till midnight, talking, or Mario reading to me. He was a banker and a dealer in money, but he read poetry exquisitely." "Vera!" Susan ejaculated suddenly, and sat staring. "What's the matter?" "I believe you love Provana better than ever you have loved Claude." "I don't know," Vera said dreamily. She had been talking in a dreamy way, as if she were hardly conscious that anyone was listening to her. "Perhaps you never were really in love with your second husband." "Yes, I loved him too much." And after a perceptible pause, "Not enough." "Darling, I can't make you out." "I'm not worth making out." "One thing I must tell you, Vera, even at the risk of agitating you. It is all over with that woman." "Which woman?" "Which? Mrs. Bellenden. There's never been so much as a whisper about any other since your marriage." "Oh, it is all over? I thought so." "Vera, what indifference! You might be talking of somebody in Mars." "Yes, dear, it is quite at an end. They had a desperate quarrel, quite the worst of many frightful rows. There was furniture smashed, I believe, Sèvres and things, and now she has consoled herself." "Really?" "A German prince, one of the German attachés, told me he would marry her if he dared. Well, sweet, I must be trudging. I'm dining out, one of those nice little winter dinners that I love. You must make haste and get quite well." This was what Susie always said to a sick friend, even when the friend was moribund. The quite had such a cheering sound. By the by, Lady O told me you have had the Princess Hermione. Yes, she came to see me 2 or 3 times when she was passing through town. That must have cheered you immensely. She is devoted to you, quite raves about you, I hear, in the highest circles. Get well, dear, and give a party for her when she is next in town." Susie kissed her and patted her hair, and suppressed a shiver at the cold brow that her lips touched. It felt like the brow of death. Yet Vera's eyes were bright, and there was a rosy bloom on the thin cheek. Susan was glad when she had got herself out of the house and was walking fast through the cheerful streets, but she was sincerely attached to her friend. "I shall be fit for nothing this evening," she told herself sadly, but she was at least fit for her part of chorus, and entertained the little dinner party with a picturesque description of her fading friend, dying slowly in that house of measureless wealth. "Her income dies with her," she explained, "and though I suppose a few pennies have been saved out of 100,000 a year, and my cousin will get all that's left, he will be a pauper in a year or 2, I dare say." On this the company speculated upon how much might be left, and all were agreed that there was a good deal of spending in 100,000, while one of the middle-aged men were so far as to make a rough calculation of the Rutherfords' expenditure in those 5 years of expensive pleasures. But even after reckoning the dances and dinner-giving, the yachts and balloons, the racing stable, and a certain amount of losses on the turf and at cards, they did not bring the annual outlay above 80,000, whereupon a dowager looked round with a smile and said, "You haven't reckoned Mrs. Bellenden." "True. Now you mention her, I take it there would be no surplus." And then that remarkable lady and her German prince were discussed at full length, dissected rather than discussed, for when a woman is remarkable for her beauty, and has spent 3 or 4 fortunes, and is in a fair way of spending another, there is a great deal of amusing talk to be got out of her. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 30. After Susan Amphlетт's disappearance, the house in Portland Place was given over to silence and solitude. Lady Okehampton was at Disbrowe, where she was on duty as a model grandmother, her daughters liking their children, to spend the early winter in the ancestral home, where there were Exmoor ponies in abundance, and plenty of clever grooms to teach the dear kiddies to ride, and a superannuated governess of the good old soul or dear old thing order to keep their young minds from rusting and coach them for their next exam, whether in music or science. Lady Okehampton was established in her country house till Christmas, and Claude had turf engagements and shooting engagements enough to occupy him nearly as long. He had been reluctant to leave his wife, but once away from the silent house, he had all manner of distractions to prolong his absence. And while Newmarket was full of life and anticipations for next year, the house in which he had left Vera was a place of gloom that had haunted him in troubled dreams and made the thought of return horrible. He wrote to her more than once, entreating her to let him take her to Cannes or Nice. She could have nurses and invalid carriages to make the journey possible, and her health would be renewed in the sunshine. But his wife's answer was always to the same effect: "I am at peace. Let me be." And then he fell back upon his stables and his racing friends, or his shooting in Suffolk, or on cards, anything to stop that horror of retrospective thought which had been like a disease with him of late years. Vera was at peace. She had no trivial visitors, was not obliged to listen to futile chatter about other people's affairs. Dr. Tower came 3 or 4 times a week, unwilling to confide so precious a life to his watchdog, the general practitioner, and was cheerful and sympathetic. She had 2 hospital nurses now, one always on guard day and night. She could no longer maintain her struggle for independence, for she too often needed a helping arm to support her as she went up and down the long corridors, or toiled slowly up the spacious staircase that had once been alive with the finest people in London, but where now the slender figure, in a soft silk gown and white fur boa, with the nursing cap and uniform, moved in a ghostly silence. Father Cyprian Hammond came to see her sometimes, and sat long and talked delightfully, but he, who was past master in the art of making proselytes, could get no nearer the mind of this woman than he had got a year before. Whatever her burden was, she would not open her heart to him. Whatever her sense of sin, she would not ask him for absolution. It was in vain that he told her what his church could do for a penitent, the ineffable power possessed by that one holy and ineffable church to heal the wounded heart, and to bring the strayed lamb back to the shepherd's arms. "Try to think of yourself in the wilderness, and that divine shepherd seeking for you," said the priest gently. But Father Cyprian, with all his gifts, could not win her to confide in him. It was only to Francis Symeon, the spiritualist, that she ever spoke of the thoughts that filled her mind, as she sat alone in the room that had been her husband's, dreaming over one of the books he had loved. Her intimacy with Francis Symeon had grown closer since the world outside that quiet room had closed upon her for ever, since he knew and she knew that the transition from the known to the unknown life was very near. He had told her the story of his own sorrows, the tragedy of love and death that had made him a mystic and a dreamer, whose hopes and convictions the world scoffed at. Life had given him all the things he desired, and last, best gift of all, the love of a perfect woman, who alone could make that life complete for himself and for others, lifting him for ever above the sphere of sensual joys and worthless ambitions. It was she who had taught him to look beyond the present life, and to consider the beauty of the world no more than a screen that concealed the glory of diviner worlds, hidden from them only while they were moving along their earthly pilgrimage, always looking beyond, always dreaming of something better. The day came, without an hour's warning, when he was to be told that her pilgrimage was nearly done. The afterlife was calling her. The divine companions were beckoning. All that there had been of high enthusiasm and scorn of life left him in that moment. He was as weak and helpless as a mother with her only child, her infant child, threatened by death. The dreamer was no more a dreamer, and only the earthly lover remained, he who was to have been her husband. He hung upon moments. He listened to every failing breath. He counted time by her ebbing strength and the opinions of doctors. He lived only to watch and to listen beside her sofa, or in the curtained twilight of her sick room, when the pretty garden parlour was no longer possible. Wherever she was carried in the vain pursuit of life, he went with her. The time of alternating hope and dread lasted nearly a year. "It was our union," he told Vera. "It was my only marriage." As I sat day after day with her hand clasped in mine, I knew that this was all I could ever know of marriage or of woman's love. From the day of her death I had done with the world, and all the rest of my days were given up to searching for those who had gone, for those who were in her world, not in mine. I have waited at the door as your dog waits when he cannot see you, and as he believes that you are there on the other side. So I believe and know that she is near me, and my days have known no other business or interest than my patient search into the books of all ages, and nations that help the science of the future life and the society of those people whom you have met in my rooms, and who think and feel as I do. I am a rich man, but I only use money for the relief of distress, and I have allowed myself no luxury or indulgence beyond my books and the rooms that are large enough to hold them and me." The hospital nurse sat in the adjoining room with the door ajar. So far, and so far only, was the patient allowed the privilege of solitude. Someone must be always there, within hearing. When she had a visitor, the door might be shut, but not otherwise. "There must be something very dreadful the matter with me," she said, when Dr. Tower insisted upon this point. "No, my dear lady, there is nothing dreadful in a tired heart. But I don't want you to faint without anybody at hand to look after you." Vera assured him that she was not likely to faint, and made mock of his care. He had been very insistent upon certain points in his treatment, which he arranged with the general practitioner who had attended her for minor ailments in earlier days, when she was rarely in need of medical care. He would not allow her to go up and down stairs any longer. That ordeal must be at an end until she was stronger. He had the dining room made into a bedroom for her use. All the gloomy old pictures and colossal furniture had been removed, and the walls were hung with delicate chintz, while the choicest things in her rooms upstairs had been brought down to make this ground-floor apartment pleasant for her. A room that smiled as it had never smiled before, even on those gala nights when a flood of light shone upon the splendour of Georgian silver and Venetian glass and diamonds and fashionable women. "You are taking far too much trouble about me," Vera said, when first she saw this transformation. "We only want to save you trouble. The ascent to the second floor of this lofty house is almost alpine. I wonder you never established an electric lift." "I never minded running up and down stairs." She remembered the first years after her second marriage, the years of trivial pleasures and hurry and excitement, and with how light a step she had gone up and down that stately staircase to give herself over to her Parisian maid, and to have her smart toilet of the morning changed for the still smarter clothes of the afternoon, while she submitted impatiently, with a mind full of worthless things. The fashion of her gown, the shape of her last new hat, that rush from one amusement to another, endless hours without pause, had been like the morphia maniac's needle. It had killed thought. All that was left of life now was thought, or rather memory, for of late thought and memory were one. Her doctors might do what they liked with her, so long as they let her stay in the silent house and did not take away her dog. Since his return from captivity, the terrier had hung about her with a love more devoted even than before their separation. He watched her as only a dog can watch the creature it loves. He would not let her out of his sight. He could not forget how he had been kept away from her, and he lived in fear of another parting. If he were not lying at her feet, or nestling against the soft folds of her gown, he was sitting at the door of her room, the door that hid her from him, the cruel door that kept him from her immediate presence. He lay at her bedroom door all night, and rushed in with the first entrance of nurse or maid in the morning, to greet her with hairy paws upon her coverlet and irresistible canine kisses upon her cheek. This was the best love that remained to her, the love that had no afterthought and left no sting. She had provided a friend for him in days when she would be no longer there. Francis Symeon had promised to take him and love him, and give him a happy old age and a gentle sleep when he was weary. As the winter days shortened, she grew perceptibly weaker, and the tired heart felt as if its work in this world must be nearly done. Mr. Symeon came every day, and stayed for a long time, a quiet figure sitting in the low armchair by the wood fire, sometimes in silence that was restful for the invalid, though she loved to hear him talk. For his thoughts were not of this narrow life and its trumpery pleasures and eating cares, but of the land beyond the veil. "Do you believe they think of us sometimes, those who have gone beyond?" Vera asked in her low, sweet voice, as they sat in the winter gloaming. "I believe they think of us often, always, if they have loved us much." "I had a friend whom I offended, cruelly, dreadfully," she said slowly, as if with an effort, "and he died before I had even begun to be sorry. And when he was dead, and I knew that his spirit was there, among the shadows near me, I was afraid, horribly afraid. I could only think of his anger, never of the possibility of his forgiveness. For a long, long time I was afraid that I should see him. I could imagine the dreadful anger in his face. His face and form were always there, in the background of my life, and I was afraid of being alone, afraid of silence and darkness and all lonely places. So I gave myself up to society and the amusements and distractions of brainless people, without ever really caring for them, only to escape thought. But I could not stop my brain from thinking. Thought went on like a relentless iron mill, grinding, grinding, grinding the same dead husks by day and night, and the friend whose love I had wounded was always there. And then there came a time when I sickened of everything upon earth, society, splendour, music, pictures, even mountains and lakes and forests, and all the beauty of the world. All things had become loathsome, and I wandered about with a restless spirit in my brain that would not leave me in peace. Then slowly, slowly, the faint, sweet sense of peace came back. The angry face was gone, and the face that looked at me out of the shadows was only sad. And then the time came when I felt that the dead had changed towards me in that dim world you have taught me to understand, and that there was pardon and pity in the great heart I had wounded. And one day the burden was lifted from my soul, and I knew that I was forgiven. Now tell me, my kind friend, was this hallucination? Was it just the outcome of my brooding thoughts, dwelling perpetually upon the same subject? Or was the spirit of my dead friend really in touch with mine? Was it by his strong will reaching across the barrier of death that the assurance of forgiveness had come to my soul? Or was I the dupe of my own imagination, my own longing for pardon? No, you were not deceived. It is for such as you that the veil is sometimes lifted, the creatures in whom mind is more than flesh, the elect of human clay. I told you as much as that years ago, when you first talked to me of the world we all believe in, we who meet together and wait for the voices out of the shadows, the wisdom and the faith that cannot die, the voices of the influencing minds. No, my sweet friend, have neither fear nor doubt. The sense of pity and pardon that has come into your soul is a message from the friend you loved. Would the happy spirit descend from the realms of light or song, should I fear to greet my friend, or to say, forgive the wrong? Believe that you are forgiven. You can know no more than that until you have passed the river, until the gate of a happier world has been opened. And then I shall be with him again, where they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but where they are as the angels of God in heaven. That is the reunion to which we all look forward. That is the faith that looks through death. There was a long interval of silence, and then she said slowly, if I could see him with these bodily eyes, see him as I see you looking at me in the firelight, I should be sure that the dream is not a dream. You have been privileged to understand the mind of your dead friend, to know that he is near you. That should be enough. Only to the rarest natures is it given to see. You questioned me about this possibility of vision once before, and I told you that I had known of one instance when the eyes of the living beheld the dead in the last moments of earthly life. "I do not think those moments are far off for me, my friend," Vera said softly. Francis Symeon, in whose philosophy death was emancipation, did not say the kind of thing that Susan Amphlett would have said in the circumstances. She no doubt would have told Vera that she was talking nonsense, and that she was going to get quite well, and live for years and years and years, and have a real good time. Mr. Symeon took her attenuated hand in his friendly grasp, and sat by her for some time in silence before he bade her his calm adieu, patted the dog, nestling against her knees, and went quietly out of the room and out of the house. He did not think that he would ever again be sitting in the firelight in that room, hearing the low, sad voice. He knew that he had shut the door upon a life that was measured by moments. 3 days after that, Vera was unwontedly restless. There had been a long telegram from her husband in the morning, announcing his return for that night. He had finished all his business with his trainer, engaged the jockeys who were to ride for him next year, and he was coming back to London. He did not say coming home, heartily sick of Newmarket and his Suffolk shooting, and the friends who had been with him. Why do we do these things and call them pleasures? He ended the message with that question, as with a moral. "Poor Claude," sighed his wife, as she folded the thin slips of paper and laid them among her books, and then she thought how much happier for him if he had stayed with the Benedictines. The days wore on, such slow days. The nurses were more and more attentive, horribly attentive. There were 3 of them now. 2 were always about her, while the 3rd slept. She had left off asking questions. Dr. Tower came every morning and sat with her quietly for a quarter of an hour, and patted and praised her dog, and told her scraps of the day's news, and was kind. But she heard him without interest, as if without understanding. She had what Susie called her mermaid gaze, as one who saw only things far away across a vast ocean. She never questioned him now, and made no allusion to the 3rd young woman in uniform who had come upon the scene so quietly that she looked like a double of one of the others, a trick of the optic nerves rather than another person. She had the nurses almost always near her, and that other sentinel, the terrier, was there always. There was no almost where his affection was concerned. As she grew weaker and moved with feebler steps, he moved nearer her. She talked to him sometimes, to the nurses never, though she was gracious to them in her mute fashion, and understood that they liked her and were sorry for her. One quiet grey evening, the closing in of a day that had been curiously mild for an English December, a day that brought back the still sad atmosphere of midwinter at San Marco, she had an unusual respite from her watchers. It was tea time, and they were sitting longer than usual over the low fire in the room beyond the library, with the door ajar. No light switched on, no sound of laughter or loud voices, just 2 well-behaved young women whispering together in the firelight. She was alone, moving slowly along the corridor. She had been wandering about for some time, with a restlessness that had increased in a painful degree of late, the dog creeping close against her skirt, until all in a moment, when she bent down to speak to him, he slunk away from her and crawled under the dark archway that opened into the deeper darkness of the hall as Vera entered through the open door of the library. At last it had come, the thing she had been waiting for. It was no surprise when the dream she had been dreaming night after night became a reality. A shiver ran through her, as if the warm blood in her veins had turned to ice-cold water. But it was awe, not horror, that thrilled her. Night after night she had awakened from a vision of Mario Provana, from the sound of his voice, the touch of his hand, the glad, vivid sense that all that was past was a dream, that he was alive, and that she belonged to him, and him only, as before the coming of trouble. She had awakened night after night in the faint flicker of the shrouded lamp when the room was full of shadows. She had awakened to disappointment and desolation. That had been the surprise, not this. There was neither doubt nor wonder now as she stood on the threshold of the dim room and saw Provana sitting by the hearth in the chair where he used to sit, calm, motionless, like a statue of domestic peace, the creator and defender of the home, the master sitting silent by the hearth fire that wedded love had made sacred. The dull red of that fading fire and the pale grey of evening outside the uncurtained windows made the only light in the room, but there was light enough for her to see every line in the face of power, where every line told of force, unalterable purpose, indomitable courage. The grey eyes looked at her, steel bright under the projecting brow, kind eyes that told her of his love, a love that fate could not change nor diminish, not death nor sin. For these first moments she believed he had come back to her, that he had escaped the bonds of death. She did not ask what miracle had brought him there, but she believed in his miraculous return. The blood ran swift and warm in her veins again. Her heart beat with a passionate joy. She stretched out her arms to him, trying to speak fond words of welcome, but her tremulous lips could give no sound. The muscles of her throat seemed paralyzed. She was yearning to tell him of her love, that she had sinned and repented, that he was the first, must always be the first in her affection. Her limbs failed her with a sudden collapse, and she sank on her knees by a large high-backed armchair that stood near the door, and clung to the arm of it with both her hands, struggling against the numbness that was creeping over her senses. She kept her eyes upon the face of all her dreams, of all her sorrow, the face she had loved and regretted. For moments her widely opened eyes gazed steadily. Then cold drops broke out upon her forehead. Her limbs shook and her eyelids drooped only for an instant. She lifted them, and he was gone. There was nothing but the empty chair, his chair in the quiet domestic evenings, before Mario Provana's house became the fashion, before the Disbrowes gave the law to his wife's existence. That was the last she saw before the lifting of the veil. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 31. Chorus was at work again, not at a London dinner table this time, but in the easier atmosphere of a North Riding manor house, which men left in the morning to shoot grouse, and came back to in the evening to gossip with their womankind, in the cheerful light of an oak-panelled dining room. Chorus was wearing black, quite the prettiest thing in complimentary mourning, which all her friends assured her suited her to perfection, and took 10 years of her age. Susan Amphlett had received that kind of compliment too often of late. She thought people were beginning to lay a disagreement stress upon the passage of time in relation to her personal appearance. "I doubt if I shall ever wear anything but black for the rest of my poor little life," she said tearfully. "That darling and I were like sisters, and that she should have died when I was in Scotland, hundreds of miles away from her. It must have been sudden. Heart failure. No one was with her. She had 3 hospital nurses to look after her, but she died alone in a dark room, while 2 of them were dawdling over their tea, and the 3rd was in bed. The dog whined, and they went to look for her. She was lying in a huddled heap on the carpet, near the open door, and that poor, faithful beast was standing by her, whining piteously." "Where was Rutherford?" "At Newmarket, of course. the only place where he has been happy for a long time, settling up next year's campaign, who was to write for him, and so on. What had become of the devoted husband you used to tell us about? Does anything last in this decadent age? There never was a more romantic couple than this sweet creature and my cousin Claude 3 years ago. Their marriage was a poem. Everything about their lives was full of poetry. Their house was the most popular in London. Their chef quite the best. They were all sweetness and light, the most brilliant example of what youth and cleverness and good looks and unlimited money can do. But the good wood before last changed all that. Vera was ennuied and run down. The two things go together, don't you know? And broke her engagement to stay with the Waterburys for the race week. Claude went there without her. You all know the sequel, so why recapitulate? Nothing was ever the same after that. Was there an inquest? Asked the host. Thank heaven that wasn't necessary. Her doctor had been seeing her every morning and knew she might go off at any moment. Heart failure. She was buried in Italy, at a dull little place on the Riviera, in the grave with her first husband and his daughter. Her own wish. She was all poetry to the last. A poet's daughter. From the tragedy of Mrs. Rutherford's early death, the conversation somehow took a retrospective cast. The people talked of the murder that had happened a long time before. It is curious how long the interest in a murder may survive if the murderer has not been discovered. There always remains something to wonder about. After nearly half a dozen years, the Provana murder could still bear discussion. People's pet theories seemed as fresh as ever, and were discussed with as much animation, while those people who had theories which they would die rather than divulge were the most interesting of all the theorists, for they could be driven to ground with close questioning, as in the familiar game of clumps, until they made a resolute stand, and refused to say another word upon the subject. I dare say it is quite horrid of me to think what I think, said one vivacious lady, and you would hate me if I were to tell you. Give us the chance at any rate. It will be a new sensation for you to be hated. One thing at least I may say. It has always been a mystery to me how those two people could bear to live in that house. Oh, but you cannot bar a fine house and your own property, because your husband has been unlucky enough to get himself murdered in it. Here Chorus, who had sat disapproving and even angry while her friends were discussing the murder, chipped in suddenly. You don't know Vera, she said. Her memory of Provana was an absolute coot, and she loved the house for his sake. It's a pity she kept her worship for the husband's memory, said somebody, for the state of things between her and Rutherford for some years was an open secret. Everybody knew all about it. Nobody knew Vera as I knew her. She had no more of common earth in her composition than if she had been a sylph. People might as well talk scandal about Undine. The men of the world who were present, and the women who knew nearly as much of life, smiled and shrugged their shoulders. Well, it is all ancient history, said a bland worldling with smooth white hair and a smooth elderly voice. The romantic friendship, the murder, the marriage with the romantic friend, dulas, ducas, dupas. Nothing can matter to anybody now. Nothing except who killed Signor Provana, said the lady who had declared she would sooner die than tell anybody her theory of the murder. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Beyond These Voices. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beyond These Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 32. Father Cyprian Hammond sat alone in the winter gloaming after a hard day's work in his parish, which was a large one, covering several of those obscure little slums that lie hidden behind handsome streets in north-western London. The table had been cleared after his short and simple dinner, and he was half reclining in his deep arm-chair, while Sabatier's Life of St. Francis of Assisi lay open on the table under the candles that made only a spot of light in the lofty room. It was one of the books which he opened often on an evening of fatigue and depression. The Life or the Fioretti were books that rested his brain and soothed his spirits. He lay back in his chair with his eyes closed, not asleep, but resting, and listening with a kind of sensuous pleasure to the light fall of wood ashes on the hearth. His winter fire of old ship logs was one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. "I told you I would see no one to-night," he said, as his servant came into the room. "It is Mr. Rutherford, father, only just back from Italy. He said he was sure you would see him." "Very good. I will see Mr. Rutherford. You can light the lamp. Come in, Claude," he called to the figure standing outside the door. Claude came into the room, while the servant lighted a standard lamp of considerable power that shone full upon a face from which all natural carnation had changed to an ashen greyness, the face of a man in the last stage of a bad illness. "You look dead beat," said the priest, as they clasped hands. "You have been travelling night and day, I suppose?" "I came straight from her grave, from their grave. She lies in the cemetery at San Marco, beside her husband and his daughter, the girl who loved her, and whose love brought those two together." "It was her wish, I conclude?" "There was a letter found, a letter written half a year ago at the beginning of her illness, in which she begged that I would lay her there, in his grave, nowhere else. It was he that she loved best, always, always. Her real, her only perfect love was for him. May that absolve her of her sins. I would have done much, striven long and late, to bring her into the fold, if she would have let me, but she would not. Well, she shall not want for an intercessor while I live and pray." And then, looking up at his visitor, who stood before him, a tragical figure in the bright, hard light of the lamp, his face haggard and wan against the rich darkness of his sable collar, "Sit down, Claude," he said gently, in a tone of ineffable compassion, the voice that, day by day, had spoken to sorrow and to sin. "I see you have come to tell me your troubles. Take off that heavy coat, and draw your chair to the fire, and open your heart to me, unless indeed you will come to my confessional to-morrow, and let me hear you there. I would much rather you did that." "Selon les règles? No. Be kind, father, and let me talk to you here. I will keep nothing back this time. There shall be no more secrets, no surprises. I have come to the end of my book. She is dead, and I have nothing left to care about, nothing left to hide. There is not a joy this world can offer a man for which I would hold up a finger, now she is gone. What do you want me to do for you? What you did for me 6 years ago, open the gate of a refuge where a sinner may hide the remnant of a worthless life, where I may spend the last dregs in the cup, drop by drop, where I may die, day by day, on my knees, in penitential prayer. I opened that gate. You were safe in such a refuge, and you broke out again and came back to the world 20 times worse than you were before. The life you have been leading since you married Provana's widow is about the most worthless, the most abject life that a reasonable being could lead, the life of empty pleasure, of sensuality and self-indulgence, a life that debases the man himself, and corrupts and ruins his associates. I had to forget. If all that the world calls pleasure could have been distilled into one little drug that would have blotted out remembrance, I should have wanted no more race-horses, no more racing yachts, no more flying machines, no more cards or dice, only that one little drug. Father, when I stood before you 6 years ago in this room, a miserable wretch, I had to keep my secret for her sake. I've nothing to hide now. It was I who killed Mario Provana. I knew. You knew? Yes, I knew that night as much as I know now. I knew the guilt you wanted to hide in a cloister. I knew your sin and your remorse. But I doubted your perseverance, a doubt that was too speedily justified by the event. It was the fatal course my mother took. She brought Veera to the place where I thought that I and my sin were buried. I did not yield without a struggle. In long days of depression and long nights of fever, I wrestled with Satan for my soul. I called upon my manhood, my honor, my willpower. I even thought that I had conquered. And then, in an instant, my passionate heart gave way, and I walked out of that house of rest, a fallen spirit. But oh, the rapture of the moment when I held her in my arms and told her that I renounced all, the hope of heaven, the certainty of peace, for her love. Oh, the pity of it, my unhappy Claude. You ask me no questions, Father? To what end? You are not in the confessional. There may be details that would in some degree mitigate your guilt. But murder is a heinous sin, and I fear in your case it had been led up to by guilt almost as dark, the spoiling of a pure woman's soul. If the murder was not deliberate, you cannot urge the same excuse for the sin of seduction, that sin which includes every abomination, hypocrisy, the falsehood that betrays a trusting fellow creature, the calculating cruelty that sets a man's strength of will against a woman's yielding love. No, no, no. Father, have you forgotten those two lost souls Dante saw driven through the malignant air, they who had stained the earth with blood? Sorrow and sin had been theirs, but Francesca's lover was not a deliberate seducer, and even in that world of pain the love that linked those two, who never could be parted more, was no base or selfish passion. No man ever fought a harder battle than I fought for her sake. I loved her when we were boy and girl together, when she was a child, a lovely, innocent child who gave me her heart in that happy morning of life, who had been shut out from all the affection that makes childhood beautiful, the caresses, the praise of an adoring mother, the love of father, brothers, sisters. She had known nothing better than the tepid kindness of a peevish old woman, and she gave her heart to me in the first joyous days of her life. I taught her what youth and happiness meant, and that springtime of our lives was never forgotten. Vera was the romance of my boyhood. I carried her image in my heart for all the years in which we were strangers, and when fate brought us together again, our hearts went out to each other, as if the years had never parted us, as if she had been still as unconscious of passion as the child who clambered on my knee and flung her arms round my neck on the rocks at Disbrow. But with a certain difference, said the priest. She was Mario Provana's wife. I did not forget that. I told myself that I need never forget it. She was the centre of a selfish clan who meant to run her for all she was worth. I knew to what account the Disbrows would turn a millionaire cousin. And I took upon myself to stand between her and a herd of cold-hearted relations who only valued her as a counter in the social game. except Susan Amphlett, who is a fool, and Lady Okehampton, who is not much wiser, there was not one of the crew that had a spark of real regard for her." "And you thought your affection was pure enough to save her from all the pitfalls of society?" "I thought that I was strong enough to take a brother's place. I had lived my life. I had been a failure. I had sinned and paid forfeit for my sin. I thought I had done with passionate feeling, and that I could trust myself as fully as Vera trusted me in her absolute unconsciousness of danger. I was deceived. The fire still burned in the grey ashes of a wasted life, and the time came when it burst into flame and consumed us." "You were with her that night when Provana came home unexpectedly?" "I was with her. No matter how that came about. The die had been cast weeks before, when she and I were at the Okehamptons' river villa. We were alone there, as if we had been in a wood, and our secret was told, and our promise was exchanged. Nothing was to matter any more in our lives except our love. We were to go to the other side of the world and cruise about in the South Seas till we found an island, as Stevenson did, a paradise of love and peace to end our days in. The yacht was waiting for us at Plymouth, manned and found for an ocean voyage, almost as fine a vessel as the Gloriana. We were to start by an early train that morning. I wrung a promise from her at Lady Fulham's ball, and we met a few hours earlier than we had intended. And he found you together, and you killed him." It was her life or his. We faced each other at the door of his dressing-room. The other door was open, and the lights were on. I saw death in his face as he stood for a moment looking into her room, the white, dumb rage that means bloodshed. He gave me only one contemptuous glance as he dashed past me to the desk where his pistol case was ready for him. He had the pistol in his hand and had cocked it in what had seemed an instant, and was on his way to her room, while I snatched the second pistol from the case. For me, he could bide his time. For her, doom was to be swift. I think I read him right, even in those fierce moments. His fury was measured by the love he had given her. His foot was on the threshold when I fired. I could hear her stifled sobs as she lay on the floor where she had fallen at the sound of his footsteps on the landing, half unconscious in her agony of shame. She told me afterwards that strange lights were in her eyes, a roar of waters in her ears. She was lying in a world of red light. "Well, what do you want of me now?" "Open the door of my cell. The Benedictines, the Carthusians, La Trappe, in France or Spain, any order where the rule is iron, and where my days will be short. I have lived the sinner's life, and it has not brought me happiness. Let me live the saint's life, and see if it can bring me peace. I am not a much blacker sinner than some of the fathers of your church who wear the aureole. Let the rest of my life be one long act of expiation, one dark night of penitential prayer." "My dear Claude, my son, all shall be done for you. The path of peace shall be made smooth, but this time there must be no turning back." "To what should I come back? The light of my life has gone out." Epilogue. A month later, when Christmas was over, and the people who had done with their guns and did not mean hunting were making a little season in London, on their way to Egypt or the Riviera, Lady Susan Amphlett, as chorus, was in her best form at cosy dinners. Now, will you believe that Claude Rutherford was a devoted husband, and that he broke his heart when his wife died? She asked triumphantly. I believe that he was nearly as much of a crank as his pretty wife. She was a disciple of Francis Symeon, and he was under Father Hammond's thumb. The dark room in the Albany, or a cell in La Trappe. There's not much difference. From a racing stable to a cloister is a bit of a leap in the dark. Claude was always a bold rider. I've seen him skylarking over a hedge on his way home without knowing where he was to land. I think he is rather lucky to land in a cloister, said the lady who had refused to tell people her theory of the Provana murder, but I wonder what they think of it all in Scotland Yard. End of chapter 32. End of Beyond the Voices by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.